Hello, everyone, and welcome to this incredibly important session on youth climate advocacy, shaping the future of island resilience. I'm Ari, one of the project managers here at Island Innovation, and I'm very excited to be co-hosting today's conversation alongside the wonderful Michaela. We're thrilled to have such a distinguished panel of experts and passionate advocates joining us as we explore the vital role of youth in shaping the future of island communities in the face of climate change. Before we dive into our discussion, I wanted to take a moment to talk about something exciting that ties in today's session. As part of our commitment to supporting youth leadership in climate action, we are hosting the Global Sustainable Island Summit and the Island Youth Forum in St. Kitts and Nevis this May. The Island Youth Forum is a pre-summit forum designed to bring young advocates together to amplify their voices and take part in shaping the future of island resilience. We're pleased to share that we're offering scholarships through the Our Shared Ocean program for youth to attend, with more details about these scholarships and how to apply shared at the end of today's panel. So please stick around for that if you're interested. Island nations are often the first to experience the devastating impacts of climate change, from rising sea levels to extreme weather events. However, these challenges also present unique opportunities for resilience, innovation, and collaboration. Today, we'll be discussing how the voices of young people can lead the charge in creating sustainable solutions and advocating for meaningful action on climate change. Our speakers come from a diverse background, ranging from scientific research to marine conservation, sustainable architecture to grassroots youth movements, and they will offer valuable insights into how we can work together to build a resilient future for islands and the world. We're looking forward to hearing from each of our panelists, and we invite you, our audience, with us throughout the session. While we'll have a Q&A at the end, please feel free to submit your questions as we go along. Thank you for being here today, and we're very excited for a lively and impactful discussion. And remember, we'll also be sharing more information about the summit and the scholarships at the end of the session. So please don't go anywhere. There's more to come. I will hand over to Michaela now, who will share a few more logistical details with you.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's so great to see so many of you here today. I'm Michaela, a business development associate at Island Innovation, and it's truly a pleasure to be co-moderating today with Ari. Happy to see so many countries represented here today. You will see a poll appear on your screen. Please let us know where you're connecting from, what sector and industry you belong to, and we'll take a look at the results shortly. In the meantime, I invite you to please make use of the chat function, introduce yourself, make any comments during the section, and please make sure to use the Q&A function for any questions that you might have for our panelists. And of course, we will do our best to address as many of them as possible when we get to that Q&A part of today's session. Okay, let's take a look at the poll results. I see we have a lot of regions represented here today, mainly the Caribbean. We also have a lot of persons joining from Europe, from North America, South and Central America, Africa, and Asia. A lot of persons joining from academia, NGO, government, and of course, private sector as well. Welcome, everyone. It's my pleasure to begin introducing our fantastic lineup of speakers for today's session. Our first speaker is Dr. Naya Sina, a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Tokyo. With a deep commitment to advancing knowledge in her field, Dr. Sina's research focuses on environmental sustainability and innovative solutions for global challenges. Her expertise and experience in both scientific research and applied environmental studies makes her a valuable voice in today's discussion on creating a more sustainable future. We're excited to hear her insights and contributions to the conversation.
Next, we have Daniel Caceres, a marine biologist and regional representative for the Sustainable Ocean Alliance. Daniel has spent years advocating for ocean conservation and sustainability, working with his communities and organizations around the world to protect marine ecosystems. His passion for marine life and his expertise in the challenges facing our oceans make him a leading voice in the global effort to preserve our seas. We're eager to hear his perspective on how we can work together to ensure a healthy, sustainable ocean for future generations.
Our next speaker is Carla Castro, an expert in sustainable design and LEED Green Associate. With a strong background in environmental architecture and design, Carla brings valuable insights into the intersection of sustainability, construction, and urban development. Her work at the Asian Institute of Technology reflects her commitment to creating energy-efficient, sustainable spaces that benefit both people and the planet. We look forward to hearing her perspective on how green building practices can contribute to a more sustainable world.
We're thrilled to also welcome Ashley Lashley, UNICEF Youth Advocate and Barbados CARICOM Youth Ambassador. Ashley has dedicated her efforts to advocating for youth empowerment and development, focusing on issues that affect young people in the Caribbean and beyond. Through her work with the Ashley Lashley Foundation, she actively works to inspire and engage youth in creating change. Her powerful voice is one of hope and change and advocacy, and we're excited to hear her thoughts on the importance of the youth movement in creating a better future.
And last but not least, we are pleased to introduce Akwanje Robinson, Youth Ambassador for St. Kitts and Nevis and a representative for CARICOM. As a passionate advocate for youth rights and social change, Akwanje works tirelessly to represent and empower the voices of young people across the Caribbean. His dedication to fostering regional cooperation and youth engagement is pivotal in shaping the future of the Caribbean. We look forward to hearing his perspectives on youth leadership and the importance of collective action in the Caribbean and beyond. Fantastic. So at this time, we'd love to hear from our first speaker, Naya. Naya, if you can come on camera and please give us your perspective. Given your experience in environmental sustainability and research-driven solutions, what do you believe is the role of scientific research in shaping climate advocacy?
Well, let me start by thanking Island Innovation for having me. Thank you, Arif. Thank you, Michaela, for guiding us through this session. And I must just say first that I come from the Cabo Verde Islands, an archipelago in West Africa, although I'm currently based in Japan as a postdoc researcher. But I'm also working on a climate resilience project in the Marshall Islands in the Pacific. So perhaps that gives me some different perspectives in terms of island nations and the challenges we face. But now addressing your question about climate advocacy, well, anyone can be a climate advocate, and we all should be climate advocates. And an important part of it is the experiences we have on how climate change gets to us, on the experiences we have in our lives, or how it forces us to move, or how it impacts our communities. But on the other side, we have the scientific aspect of climate change. And I would say that climate research or scientific research is to climate advocacy the same as a Bible it is to a Christian who's trying to spread the gospel. Although I'm not talking about religion, but I'm talking about the importance that science is when you do your activism and your advocacy, because it provides you the evidence that you need to support your arguments, to support why you are advocating for this cause, but also to fight all of this recent lack of common sense that we can find in so many areas of our societies, whether it's in the political aspect, whether it's with social media and so on. You have to be backed up by truth. You have to be backed up by facts. You have to be backed up by evidence. So that makes scientific research so important. And this leads to also the effort that us as young advocates, we have to have, whether we are researchers and scientists or not, in understanding science and in looking up whatever we can for better understanding of scientific facts and scientific events. Because when we go and we are faced with an opposition or we are faced with some challenges, we need to be able to explain it. But I think this leads to a different type of question, that it's almost like a reverse Uno on the question you posed to me, which is, what is the role of scientific research, what is the role of climate advocacy in shaping scientific research? Because this also puts the responsibilities in us as scientists, as researchers, to simplify how we communicate science. It is important that we communicate to our peers through scientific publication, conferences, and so on. But we also have a societal duty to communicate science to lay people, to simplify the language, to make the science digestible to everyone, even those that have never heard of any scientific terms. That is our duty. At least that's what I believe, right? Because, of course, we can make science for ourselves, for our careers, but I think that's what I advocate as someone coming from a small island and developing state, that we make science for people and for our societies and our communities. So I guess these two things are intertwined, and it's important for us to have this idea and be aware of our responsibilities as scientists. So I guess that would be my answer.
Yeah, definitely. As you said, I think it's important to be aware of that and to acknowledge that. How can young researchers really bridge that gap between science and policy and make sure that they have an impactful change?
Well, these are two of the most complex things, both research and science and policy making. And the topic itself, climate change, it is complex. Um, and of course, I could give you a couple of standard tips on, oh, yes, we definitely, going back again to the first question, simplify complex data and try to create different ways to communicate with the communities, but also with policymakers, whether it's through social media or using more interactive ways to communicate science, or maybe promote the participation of young researchers in political panels or conferences or government events. But I think I want to take a different approach, that, often we tend to separate scientists from politicians. And I am of the position that everything that we do in our lives is political. The food that we eat, the clothes that we dress, where we go, where we study, what we do. Everything is political, as much as we don't want it to be. I think we shouldn't confuse politics with partisanship. Party is something else, but everything we do in our life is political. And we shouldn't separate researchers from politics, not in the sense that we have to be biases or use sciences for political agendas, but understanding that we are also political agents. And we have to be, someone said, we have to be the change that we want to see in the world. So it is a challenge I pose to myself and also to other fellow researchers and young researchers to engage more actively in politics, because we can advise politicians on what to do. We can produce all these beautiful reports, but who else other than us to actually be the change that we want to see in politics, and to actually make environmental climate politics that actually make sense and that are made by someone who actually understand about the topic, instead of understanding more about the lobbies and political views and so on. And I wanted to just, because I know we are limited on time, just to give an example of this amazing group that's called Black in Marine Science. It's a group that basically just started a couple of years ago, started in the US, but is spreading throughout, to try to just bring more Black folks into marine science. And I think especially when we're talking certain areas in the globe, you will go to scientific conferences and you will not see a lot of representation. And it's not just Black folks, most minorities will not be there. And it's basically about creating opportunities for us. It's not because we don't exist. It's often because we don't have opportunities. It's because we don't have such an easy visa access. It's because we don't have so much funding. So basically, this is also a political stand. You can say, well, yes, it's trying to bring social justice and equality into science, but this is also political. So I guess this is basically my answer, is that we have to be, as researchers, and especially when we're talking about climate advocates, we cannot separate research and a political stand. So we are political agents as well. And we should make that change that we want to see. That would be my answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Naya. Very, very powerful words there. You said, who else other than us to be the change that we want to see? And I think that's absolutely fantastic. This time I'll hand over to Ari to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Michaela, and thank you, Naya. And to bring Naya's message and sentiment to light of being the change that you want to see in the world, our speaker very much embodies just that. Daniel Caceres, if you could turn your camera on. Daniel is a passionate advocate for marine conservation who I had the good fortune of traveling around Latin America conducting research for the United Nations Decade of Ocean Science with, and who I'm very pleased to be sharing this space with again. Daniel, we would love to hear your thoughts on ocean conservation. As islands are so closely tied to their surrounding marine ecosystems, do you consider it to be a key pillar of climate resilience for island nations? And if so, why? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ari. Thank you, Michaela, Jerome, Christian, and also to Island Innovation and also Naya. I really agree with all your points, specifically on the points of being political actors. I think that is very important in everything that we do, like you mentioned. So thank you so much also for sharing that previously. And when we talk about islands, I think it's very important that we talk about the human populated islands, but we also talk about the not human populated islands. For example, in Peru, people don't usually think of Peru like a country from islands, but we have over 72 islands, none of which are inhabited by humans, but they're a place of biodiversity. And I think when we also talk about islands, we need to understand that islands originated before our species, before humans before we were created. So most of the biodiversity in island nations and in islands all around the world existed way before our existence and were established way before we humans even existed over 300,000 years ago. So it's very important to understand that first, islands were colonized by biodiversity, by marine biodiversity, then by terrestrial biodiversity, and then we humans arrived later. So when we talk about islands, it's very important to talk about the human populated islands and the not human populated islands. And it's very important that we talked about the great biodiversity, the biodiverse islands, and the not very biodiverse islands. Why is it very important that we separate those also? When Darwin first went to the Tenerife Islands, he realized there was so much biodiversity, but then a couple days later in his voyage, he found that there were islands close to Tenerife that had almost very, very little biodiversity. And why is that? And that is because there's a colonization process of biodiversity in islands. So we have islands that are very, very, very biodiverse and islands that are very little biodiverse, and that is because of how long they've been created. So islands that have very much little biodiversity are islands that have really recently been created, or originated from volcanoes or from tectonic activity overall that have emerged. And those are the type of islands, for example, that we have on the Eastern Pacific. In the Eastern Pacific, mostly in the Nazca Ridge, we have a lot of islands that are relatively new. So these islands are very low in biodiversity. And what does that mean when we talk about resilience? The most resilient islands are always the islands with the most amount of biodiversity. So these islands that we have on the Eastern Pacific part, in Ecuador, in Peru, in Chile, they're usually islands with less biodiversity, with more population, but that are very vulnerable, therefore, to climate change overall. And it's also very important that we understand when we talk about islands that we know that every person here that has an island in their countries or that are their island originated nations, they understand the period or the time moment when humans first arrive on the island, because that is an indicator of how much biodiversity health it's going to be there. And why is that? Because we all humans arrived, like I mentioned, way later, way after. We were actually the last species to colonize islands in most of the nations around the world. We reached, for example, Oceania, Australia, 40,000 years ago, and then we reached all the other islands around 30 to 20,000 years ago. And actually in the Caribbean islands, for example, we humans didn't arrive there until around 12,000 years ago, while biodiversity has been there for millions of years before. And so it's very important that we understand our human presence because we ourselves are an introduced species to most of the islands. So I think it's very important that we understand ecological concepts like that, like introduction of species, so we understand specifically how we mitigate and reduce our human impact and human presence on our islands most of all. So like I mentioned, first of all, it's very important that we understand our niche as humans in the islands. It's very important that we understand that there are islands that also need priority, that are islands that are not human populated, because sadly, now in the environmental movement, in the environmental world, a lot of the things that is moving, it's very anthropocentric. And what is that doing? It's leaving voices from biodiversity that are not in human populated places to not have a voice and actually be more vulnerable. Because, like I mentioned, the Eastern Pacific Islands are not human populated and are also very low in biodiversity, which makes them very, very vulnerable to climate change overall. And then also, we have, besides our species, we have the introduction of other species, which is, for example, mice. A lot of the islands are colonized by mice and cats. Cats are responsible for over 30 species that are extinct, and most of them in island places, in places where there are no predators and they weren't used to that. So I think that is very important to discuss. And I really like that comment that you talk about Galapagos, and that you mentioned Peru. We actually have one island that's called Isla Lobos Afuera, that's called the Galapagos of Peru, but because it's not human populated, and it's because it was so far to reach, it has just been exploited by fishermen that go around it and exploit it. Well, it's been believed to be such as much as biodiverse as Galapagos because it was very close to it. And actually, there's a book by Yuval Noah that you guys probably read, and then there's an article that talks about Galapagos. Actually, the reason why Galapagos has so much biodiversity still in the region is because it was the last island to be colonized by humans. It was the last place to have any type of human group involved. Actually, the first human arrived in Galapagos in the 17th century. So that's why it's a hypothesis that there's still so much biodiversity that's there. So I think it's very important that we also not romanticize our species. So because like I think one of the questions I was asked is what's in the the purpose of research, the purpose of science. I believe firmly that the purpose of us as, of science today should be to mitigate our species. We're 8 billion human beings today. 10,000 years ago, we were only 1 million humans. In 1800s, we were 1 billion. Now we're 8 billion humans. And what happens also when populations rise, range of distribution rise? So every day we're colonizing new habitats that used to be only exclusively for biodiversity. So I think it's very important that science also serves a purpose to mitigate and control our species, which, like I mentioned, is also an introduced species, which is one of the points in the Cunning Montreal framework, the introduced species and invasive species. We're an introduced invasive species in most of the islands. And I think it's very important that we understand and accept concepts because just like today, there are people that deny climate change. I see a lot in environmental movement, a lot of people that deny environmental concepts like invasive species and overpopulated species. And if there are people that deny climate change, and if that's very, very dangerous to think about, it's very dangerous to also have human groups romanticize our species and human groups denying that we're an invasive, overpopulated species. And I think if we don't understand and we don't see ourselves that way, which is just an ecological concept, we're going to be also denying how we're going to be able to actually and truly work on regards to conservation of species. So I think that will be my participation, Harry. Thank you so much.
Daniel, thank you so much. I'm always learning so much for you and your insightful comments on this division of islands, making us step back and think about the influence of colonization, its ecological implications, and the importance of also not romanticizing our species and our role to play. So thank you for that. Just before we move on to our next speaker, as someone who has recently been selected to join the Explorers Club, so 50 people changing the world that the world needs to know about, I think you're well equipped to provide insights on how we can empower youth to take meaningful action on marine protection and encourage sustainable ocean practices. So just a few words, if you could, on that before we move on to Carla. Thank you.
Sorry, Ari, couldn't hear you in the last thing you
Yeah,
mentioned.
effectively, how can we empower youth to take meaningful action?
Okay, so I think that I love that question because we're the first generation, like I mentioned, to actually understand who we are. We're the first generation to actually understand the concept, for example, of extinction of species. The concept of extinction of species, for example, is started in the 1780s. So it's a relatively new concept also, and most of the people ignore concepts like that. And it's very cool because when the first person to actually bring the concept of extinction of species was George Cuvier in 1780, and when he was a scientist and he brought that concept, most of the scientists around the area denied it also. They're like, that's impossible. Species don't go extinct. There's a God that created species, and there's a God that won't let species disappear. And people used to make fun of him. And just like that is happening with every type of ecological concept that has arose. For example, the concept of planetary limits is from 2012. The concept of carrying capacity is from 1970. The concept of population dynamic, of overpopulation, they're all relatively new concepts. So we've been denying ecological concepts even recently. So we young people, we're the first generation, like I mentioned, to actually understand that we are not a divine species. We're the first generation to actually understand that we're more species that just evolved, and we expanded, and we've invaded, and we've colonized everywhere. Actually, most of the biodiversity that was lost in my region occurred over 10,000 years ago with different types of human groups that arrived. Even way before the arrival of Europeans, most of the megafauna got disappeared and went extinct just because of our human expansion 12,000 years ago. So I think we're the first generation to actually understand ecological concepts, that understand that we're not a divine species, and understand the importance of creating policy and governing based on those ecological concepts and those planetary limits that we know of today.
Thank you so much, Daniel. And the comments in the Q&A chat say it all. You have provided some incredible insights, and we look forward to hearing more of your comments later. I'll now pass over to Michaela, who will introduce our next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Ari. Let's turn to our next speaker, Carla Castro. Carla, you have a strong background in environmental architecture and design. As an expert in sustainable design, from your perspective, how can we develop sustainable architecture and resilient infrastructure for island nations?
Hello, everybody. It's really an honor to be a part of this Island Innovation series, and discussing this topic that's not just relevant, but I feel like it's really urgent. I really love kind of piggybacking off the two first speakers. I love how you're talking about the role of science in this, because as an architect, this is something that it's basically our base. We need it to be able to define how we're going to build our built environment, especially if we want our built environment to be one that goes kind of in, creates a how do you call it, a symbiotic relationship with nature. As Daniel was explaining, we're not a divine species. I love that concept. We're actually one of the species, right? So we need to figure out how to go back to work with nature instead of basically erasing and building whatever we want, which is what we've been doing over the past few years. So how can we shape the future of island resilience through sustainable architecture and resilient infrastructure? That's what I've been dedicating myself for the past 6 years, mainly because island nations like ours are at the front lines of climate change. I mean, we're seeing rising sea levels, we're seeing stronger hurricanes and more frequent hurricanes. We're seeing economic vulnerabilities that threaten not just our homes, but our very way of life. And we have the opportunity to change that. We have the opportunity to really rethink the way that we build and the way that we plan our cities, so that we can actually empower our future generations to lead this transformation. So my name is Carla Gautier. Sorry for the correction there. Castro is my second last name because in Spanish we use both. And I'm the founder of Conti Design Build Studio. It's a firm that integrates sustainable architecture, engineering, and construction management. So that's why design build, we really believe that we have to do the whole process for our buildings to actually become living organisms. And we use science as a base to be able to do that. Like, we want to mimic nature. We don't want to just again, erase it and start over. But there's no point in doing that. You end up just mitigating. So what we want is to create resilient, affordable, and climate adaptive structures. Conti Design was born from the devastation of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico in 2017. And basically, while I was working with FEMA, I witnessed firsthand the lack of access to proper housing and the growing need, the growing need for infrastructure that could actually withstand that extreme weather. before that, rising housing costs were already pushing families out of safe living conditions. So without sustainable and cost-effective solutions, that cycle of vulnerability just kind of became worse. And then Maria basically erased and gave us a new, let's call, like, it's a really sad situation, but it did give us a new opportunity to actually like rethink the way that we're going to build and rebuild. So I knew we needed to take a different approach, one that really prioritized climate resilience, affordability, and long-term sustainability. So that's why at Conti Design, we use shipping containers and upcycled steel to create modular hurricane-resistant structures and earthquake resistance and fire resistance. Because we don't just need this to be durable, but we also need it to be quickly deployable. At the same time, our projects integrate zero waste principles, renewable energy, and regenerative design. So that regenerative design part of it is actually the one that really ties back to the science that we've been talking about, because what we're trying to do is really build spaces that work with their environment rather than against it.
Definitely. I think what you said there in terms of building back better, in a sense, making sure that our
Correct.
infrastructure is more resilient. Definitely a sad situation in terms of having to build back, but it's good to take that opportunity to then be able to become more resilient for the future. How can youth drive innovation in sustainable housing and urban planning? What do you see the role of youth being here?
That's actually, I love this question, especially because one thing that we've been seeing as I've been building my team, and getting people involved into this is we definitely need a variety of ages and generations to be able to tackle this problem. It's a very complicated a situation that we're dealing with, and it's something that needs to it needs to happen fast. I mean, we are about to cross all those planetary boundaries. Like, we don't really have that much time, and we're talking about people's lives. So the cool thing is that I've seen a lot of young professionals, students, and emerging leaders, whether it's in schools or people that have actually joined our team. But a lot of the times the people leading this movement are young professionals, which is something that's really inspiring to see. We're seeing a lot of youth-led initiatives that are pushing for modular construction, upcycled materials, reusing of materials, and most importantly, self-sustaining homes, in my case, that are not only resistant to disasters, but that also harmonize with the environment. So through architecture, engineering, and urban planning, we can actually design energy efficient, climate adaptive spaces that work with nature rather than against it, as I said before. And one of the cool things about this process is that at Conti, we've actually been seeing firsthand how younger generations actually embrace AI-driven project management, circular economy principles, climate conscious design, and everything just to basically be able to reduce costs, reduce waste, and reduce our environmental impact. Because for us, making hurricane resistant homes, with recycled materials, adding biogarden septic systems, for example, is something that we do for water conservation and to be able to provide food security. When you really look at a building in a way, the same way that we look at our bodies and that our bodies and other species work, in a way that's kind of self-sustaining, literally, not just technologically, but it's about creating your own resources, then you're actually creating independence. And what's interesting is that our generation, because like what Daniel was saying, like, we do understand that we're not going to be here forever if we don't change. We can't necessarily depend on central grids and the government like doing everything for us. We've realized that, we've accepted it. Now we need to move on and figure out what those solutions are. I think that's why the younger generation is actually driving this, and you just kind of open to experimenting and doing things better.
Definitely fantastic to hear about the younger generation being a part of it, and hearing about technology like AI being used within this industry as we work towards a resilient future. Thank you so much, Carla, for that insight. Back over to you, Ari.
Thank you, Carla. Thank you, Michaela. Next, we're very excited to hear from Ashley Lashley, an incredibly well-established and dynamic leader in the youth advocacy for climate action space. Ashley, as we look to engage young people in shaping climate policy, we'd love to hear your thoughts on how effective youth advocacy strategies for engaging policymakers and mobilizing communities can be actioned, sort of given the importance of the grassroots efforts in driving change. We'd also like to discuss how to ensure that youth voices are actually heard in these critical discussions. Over to you.
Definitely. Thank you, Ari, for asking me the question. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone on the call. It truly is an honor to share my perspective as a youth advocate in this space for over the last 7 years, I think. So firstly, let's be honest. Advocacy for us as young persons isn't always easy, especially as young persons engaging with policymakers. I'm sure many of you on the call could attest that sometimes it feels like trying to get Wi-Fi in the middle of the ocean. We are somewhat frustrated. It can be slow, and sometimes persons are never sure if anyone is listening. But here's the thing that I've recognized is that effective youth advocacy isn't just about shouting or who's shouting the loudest. For me, effective youth advocacy is all about collaboration. It's about working together with government, the private sector, and other civil society organizations to really drive real change. So for me, I often ask the question, how do we as young advocates really capture the attention of policymakers? And first, to be honest, we need to speak their language. A lot of persons, even though they might not be policy related or policy leaders, everyone relates to a story. But what we've recognized is that policy leaders or policymakers connect and relate to numbers, data, and impact. And these are some things that I've recognized that really allow policymakers to sit up where young persons are in the room discussing the impact of the climate crisis within their related or respective communities. So for instance, if you walk into a meeting and you just say, we need climate action, you might get a few nods and not necessarily a lot of action. But what I've recognized is if you walk into a room with numbers highlighting that 50% of our coastal line is at risk of erosion, or even relating back to your classroom if you're still in school, at least my class having 20 students, only 5 are aware about the impact of the climate crisis. Or even you have embarked on an initiative that really mobilized over 500 young persons to really understand their role in taking action for the environment. So suddenly when you bring that dynamic and when you bring that change, you're not just a young person with a dream or with an idea, you're actually a young person with a plan. And that's how ideally I started the Ashley Lashley Foundation. It was based upon an idea recognizing as a young person that the impact of the climate crisis is interconnected to the health of our people. I've recognized that a lot of attention, at least 5-6 years ago, wasn't really being played or wasn't really being spoke about how the impact of the climate crisis does affect people's physical health and their mental health. And that led me just to come up with an idea and walk right into UNICEF office and address that more young persons need to understand the link of climate justice and also health justice, especially coming from small island developing states. And with that conversation, I mean, I did get a few drawbacks saying, well, actually, you don't just do it like that. You need to write a concept note. You need to write a proposal. At the time, I was like 16, 18, and I never even heard about those words because I was now finishing secondary school. But it all comes back to the mentorship after that first initial conversation that I received. And since then, we were able to grow the Hey campaign to become one of the largest youth climate and health movement globally, really empowering over 900 young persons on the intersection of climate and health and providing access to grant funding. So for me, when it really comes to policy making and the engagement of policy, effective youth advocacy, for me, one thing that have stood out for me along the ways is being able to collaborate with everyone or most persons across civil society organizations, private sector, and government. Because at the end of the day, as young persons, we shouldn't have the idea that we can do it alone. I personally believe that you get a lot more done when it comes to collaboration and partnerships.
Thank you so much, Ashley. I love your initiative just to storm into UNICEF office at the age of 16, 17. Maybe we should have inspiration from that. I think you've pretty much kind of covered my next points, but I'd like you still to maybe give a few kind of highlights or of ideas that you could suggest of key lessons that youth-led initiatives in the Caribbean that can perhaps inspire some of the audience and apply that to their respective island communities or the different communities that they work with, beyond just storming into the UNICEF building.
No, definitely. I mean, for me, I can only speak about my experience engaging and leading on many different youth activities, not only in Barbados, but across the Caribbean and by extension, other small island developing states. And for me, one of the biggest lessons that I have learned is that it's not always about how many people show up for the climate movement or for your relative project. It is about what happens or what you do after an event occurs. So I can even relate back to two activities that I organized, the Barbados Youth Climate Action Summit, which was the first time in Barbados a youth forum in 2022 was convened to really allow young persons to understand the impact of the climate crisis and the policies that were being developed by our government. And you would think that you were hearing all of the notion about the climate crisis, how it's affecting us. You would really think that a lot of young persons or even teachers and schools would have shown up. But that first year, our overall target was to have 500 youth engaging. But we only had, for the first day of the summit, at least 150 young persons came out. But there were so many persons present outside of that number from the United Nations sector, from government agencies, that really understood from that first initial conversation or that first initial summit the importance of having youth voices in the climate crisis conversation. And from that specific event, what then was one of the biggest lessons was having good communication strategy and good public relations strategy. That even although you might not make the target of your climate or even any other activities, it's all about what you do after, ensuring that you have a great communication strategy during and post the event. So we were able to communicate the hell out of the photos, the videos from the different speakers that we received. And the next year that we did the Barbados Youth Climate Action Summit, we actually had over 500 plus students where there weren't enough seats. So I would say that was one of the biggest lessons that I would have had, whereby it taught me that sometimes success isn't about immediate answers, but is about what you build from that moment forward. And I think that goes back to the first question in which you asked, because you might not get an instant reaction from policymakers, from funders, but consistency is key when you're passionate and determined to make a change across multiple communities and really trying to mobilize that change at a grassroots level. So for me to answer everything in summary, I would say effective youth advocacy for me isn't about one big moment. I mentioned it is about consistency, but it's also about learning how to navigate conversations with policymakers and really ensuring that even the smallest initiatives or ideas don't just fade away, but it grow into something much bigger. So I guess I can stop there. Thank you.
Ashley, thank you so much. Very inspiring. And we're looking forward to hearing a little bit more from you later in the Q&A session. I'm going to pass over to Michaela now, who will introduce the next speaker that we've been working closely with on the Global Sustainable Island Summit. Thank you, Michaela.
Thank you, Ari. And this is just a reminder for everyone in the audience. If you have any questions for any of our specific panelists or just generally, please make use of the Q&A function. As after we hear from Akwanje, we will be hopping into that discussion. So Akwanje, we're delighted to have you with us here today. As a CARICOM Youth Ambassador, we'd love to hear your perspective on what role youth can have in shaping national and regional climate policies.
Well, thank you for the question. I honestly feel like youth have a very pivotal role in shaping policy, not just in their local territories, but on the global front. Locally, we have many different means by which youth can do such. One of which is most important is youth parliament. What we do in youth parliament is we come together as youth and we do extensive research on issues and we put together a bill, just like how parliamentarians go into parliament and pass laws, debate bills for them to be enacted into law. We also do that as youth on various issues. For example, we've debated on the blue economy, where we did research across our local landscape, especially involving the Department of Marine Resources. And we went into Parliament as government ministers. We pretend to be ministers of Parliament. So we have a Prime Minister and the different ministers. And we debate that bill and we put it forward to the government, the policymakers, and say, this is what we are as youth and this is what we wish to do. Other means by which youth can shape policy is by championing these causes at the global fora like COP and the very own Global Sustainable Island Summit. So events like these where youth can present their thoughts to policymakers from all around the world that sit at high tables that govern policy, just making our voice loud and clear and heard, and ensuring that our voice is not just listened to, but factored into the governance that shapes our society.
Fantastic, thank you. And we'd just love to hear your perspective on grassroots movements as well. Why do you think it's important to build grassroots movements for climate justice and resilience? And what are some effective ways that this can be done?
Well, conferences like COP, regional summits like GCIS, and climate negotiations must not just invite young people as observers, but as equal participants. When youth delegates and climate champions sit at these tables, we bring lived experience, innovative solutions, and a sense of exigency that no official report can truly capture.
Agreed. Thank you so much, Akwanje. So at this time, I'd like to invite all of our panelists back on camera so we can hop into our Q&A session for today. So first up, I just present this question to any of our panelists. How can the global community better support youth-led initiatives in island nations to ensure long-term climate resilience? happy for any of you to hop in. Carla, yeah, I see you're unmuted.
There we go. I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? Because I was having trouble joining into the video.
Sure. So the question was, how can the global community better support youth-led initiatives in island nations to ensure long-term climate resilience?
Yeah, happy to answer that. I think at least, I can answer that from my perspective in regards to, modular and renewable housing. I think what's really important is that, island nations across the globe share these challenges. And we can exchange ideas, policies, best practices so that we can actually accelerate these solutions. That's definitely the way to do it. We need to take advantage of, the globalization that we have produced in a good way, so that we can, actually make modular housing with renewable energy integrations, like passive cooling strategies and community driven development. Those are just a few approaches that do have global implications, but that also need to be thought of at a localized level. So one example that I can come up with is like some of our models for our homes are actually totally shippable. So for example, I am in conversations with some people in the U.S. Virgin Islands, mostly, where construction there is incredibly expensive because you need to import absolutely everything. It's in Puerto Rico, we do import everything or most things, but it's kind of like a double situation, right? So how can we really kind of work together? And I think to be able to do that, what we really need now is real investment in innovation and collaboration between the sectors. I loved what was being talked about before with how to support policy and all this thing. Like, it is all about collaboration. If we allow policy to allow this collaboration, which is an interesting conundrum, because a lot of the times, like some of the reasons we cannot do these collaborations is not necessarily because people don't want to, but mostly because the policies won't allow it. So when it comes to building, there's a lot of licenses involved. There's a lot of permitting involved, a lot of things that the government has to come into play. And I think if we do, shift our mind into a more collaborative approach, we can change that so that, for example, we can build maybe part of the property or the house in Puerto Rico and ship it there, while another team is building all the on-site work that's going to make sure that biologically the building actually works in a self-sustaining manner, right? Like, we can figure out how to connect all these two things, because it's, we have to remember that island resilience is not just about our survival, it's about us being able to thrive. And I think working together to be able to build smarter, stronger, and in harmony with our natural environment is the only way to do it.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much, Carla. And while we have you here, just one question from the audience. Someone said, I believe legislation is important in pushing green architecture. I've seen before legal cases where groups use current laws to introduce the idea of the right to a clean environment. Can we use that technique for green architecture, or is that something that depends on the jurisdiction one lives in? And to add to that, how can youth advocate for such legal change without bringing about a court case?
Great question. It does depend completely on where you live. And that's actually what makes it so difficult for us to really push these technologies and these techniques out into the world. Like, I'm not gonna lie, a lot of the times when I am doing a permit, there's a section here in Puerto Rico that asks us if it's a green building. It is a green building. It is the greenest building, people make. But I never click that button. Why? Because they make your life impossible. So it's like, it's easier to actually build something that is not green, that is not thought through, than it is to build something that is better for the environment and for everybody else. So I think like that's something that's super important when it comes to policy. I'm not an expert in policy at all. This is why we have other people in this chat for. But it is, it is something that definitely sometimes ends up, blocking innovation. So I think the way, we need to really work on how we actually make it easier for people to build back better, build back greener, rather for them to make it harder. I'm not sure if I answered the second question.
It sounded good to me.
Okay.
Yeah, please also put your information in the chat so people can maybe follow up. Just in the interest of time, I know we could talk about this forever. But I'm keen to have some of the questions in the chat directed at all of you. So I know that we have a few questions with some specific speakers. So one of them says, Dear Kwanje, thank you for sharing how youth parliaments work. Can you please tell us how the policy you created was received by the different governments of the countries from which the youth ambassadors come? From Judith in Jamaica.
Thank you, Judith. Well, depending on the policy, of course, and given its relevancy, the government usually receives our action with positivity. We've never received backlash regarding our policy propositions. So I would say that we are generally commended for our efforts and our interest in shaping policy. So if you're wondering about how our island nation policymakers receive our action regarding policy, I would say note that it's received well.
Fantastic, thank you.
I hope this answered your question.
Great. And, having worked with you and the St. Kitts government, it's nice to see that symbiotic relationship. I know it's not the same for everyone, but it's a very wonderful example to witness. So yeah. Daniel, I see your camera's off. I don't know if you've disappeared. So if not, someone else can jump in. But someone asked, with community migrations towards cities or megacities, how do you see the positive or negative impacts on islands? Maybe if Daniel is not here, maybe Naya or Ashley.
I think Naya could probably answer that question better. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So can you please repeat again? Sorry, Ari.
Okay. With community migrations towards cities or megacities, how do you see the positive or negative impacts on islands?
Oh, that's complex. The islands are also so different, but Daniel also put up a great idea in my head today that we are intrusive species, and yes, we are invasive species. But I can give you the cases that I know best, which is my country, Cabo Verde, and now the Marshall Islands. The impact is having is that it's creating more vulnerability. It's creating more vulnerability for those who just move and cramped up in big cities. Um, Small islands especially don't have much land area. So that means the cities are packed, are overpopulated, and it just concentrates everything in one place, which it might be good because it gives the rest of the island some room to breathe, maybe. But it means that you will have a lot of places that are isolated, I think, from the social, just from a pure socioeconomic point of view. And in Cabo Verde situation, we have in the Caribbean, I believe that you also face the same thing, which is a heavy impact of tourism. So, and this also impacts how people in the islands move because that's where the job opportunities are. So in Cabo Verde, there's two islands out of 10 that are the touristic hotspots, and that's where everyone migrates to. Which might be maybe good from a socioeconomic point of view, but from the ecosystem point of view, these are also the places where the marine biodiversity suffers a lot, which is where we have a lot of coastal erosion, which is where we have a lot of violations of environmental regulations. So it is complex. And then with a lot of climate change effects, what is happening as well is that not only people are moving to cities, but people are moving away from the islands and are migrating to the global north. And with um, climate change intensifying in Cabo Verde, for example, we're having longer periods of drought. We have had 2 years with no rain at all. So farmers and people that used to live in the countryside and did some sustainable practices in terms of agriculture and farming are leaving, which means that in society wise, these people are more vulnerable. And this also has an impact on the ecosystem. So it is complex. And each island, I think, depending on the region that you're talking about, will have some specificities. But I would definitely love to see our islands more resilient in that sense, and that every island could probably allocate instead of us focusing more on moving back to cities, let's move back to the coastal areas, let's move back to the countryside and spread out a bit more, and yeah, stay more in the islands. I think it's related, and this is bringing me, sorry for maybe jumping the question, but there is a question in the chat that I think is talking a little bit about this, about how can we support systems and healthy narratives that encourage young people in island communities to see staying and contributing locally of their islands to something that is viable and fulfilling paths of success. And I think it's a little bit related to that, and especially speaking as an island person who is away. So in my PhD, I tried to focus my PhD working with the coastal communities of my country and working together with them to try to help them in co-managing in protected areas. So whether you decide to stay or you decide to leave, the most important thing I guess is to try to build resilience and sustainability in island communities, whether you are inside or outside. And if you are outside, and as someone who is outside, don't ever forget where you came from, and try to, either through your advocacy or through your research, try to make it useful to your country or to other island nations, and perhaps try to connect, just like we're doing now here through Island Nation, to connect with other island countries and other island communities. We often face similar challenges, and we will gain a lot in exchanging knowledge and being connected, despite the fact we are so spread out. But yeah, that would be my answer.
Thank you so much. And brain drain is a huge thing that we've experienced with the Caribbean Climate Justice Leaders Academy as a huge problem in the different regions around the world, not just specific to the Caribbean. And I put that question into the chat because it's also something that I wanted Daniel to answer. Again, I know that you might have different takes on this and different, personal experiences. Naya, you're now in Japan. Daniel, I think you're still in Peru. I can never be quite sure where you are. But perhaps if you could shed a little bit of light on the same subject, and then we will close up because I know that we are over time. So thank you all for being patient and listening to our wonderful speakers.
Well, I love what Naya said. I agree with her completely. I also think now also that there's so many of us humans everywhere, and we're in many vulnerable places. I think concentrating us in a single place makes it easier to manage water resources. Like, sorry, can you hear me? Like,
I can hear you.
yes. So, okay, so it makes it easier to manage resources. It makes it easier to control pollutants. It makes it easier to control waste. It makes it easier to clean the water that's been polluted. So I really do like the concentration of humans in a place, because it helps with controlling the waste and controlling everything to mitigate the impacts that it has. But I think it's very important that we design the cities, and that we plan them very well to incorporate them, and that we also have a fixed carrying capacity in the cities. Because, for example, cities in Peru that were designed for 40,000 people today have over 1 million people in some of our bigger places. So people have to respect carrying capacities. So, and that's something that doesn't happen in city usually. Usually cities are designed for a certain amount of people, because they're always designed with a fixed number, and then they expand towards that. So that makes systems fail, that makes traffic happen, that makes transportation collapse. And that's because of a population is growing so much in such an extensive place that we cannot say no for people to move into a certain place. So I think fixing and maintaining and respecting the carrying capacities of cities and places is essential. Even of countries, I think every country should have designed carrying capacity. I think just like ecosystems have a carrying capacity for rabbits, a carrying capacity for deer, a carrying capacity for wolves. I think we humans need to have carrying capacities everywhere that we need. Also, like I mentioned, when populations tend to rise and increase, also the range of distribution increase. So we're going to be having new problems in coastal areas because people tend to also move and expand in coastal communities. And that's a problem also because as we expand, we also bring waste. We have a demand of water, and which makes salt water be intrusive when there's wells. We also bring dogs with us. We bring cats with us. So we're also bringing new issues into coastal areas. So I think having a carrying capacity, like I mentioned, regards to where it is, that's the most important thing. And also, I think one of the key things that youth can do today, if we really care about youth and we care about children, is family planning. I think just deciding when we want to have children, and deciding if the environment is it's fit enough for that child to be born. I think that's the biggest just you can do to a kid. I mean, to a children, to youth. I mean, planning a youth, deciding when to reproduce ourselves I think, is the wisest decision that we humans can make. Or even deciding if we're not going to do it. Like, I'm not going to have kids now because the environment is in crisis, because there's so many people in poverty now that I want to make sure that we help those that are in poverty today before I bring new kids to the planet. I think that's also one of the greatest things that we can do. If we love children and youth, that means loving them since before birth.
Very profound. Thank you, Daniel. Yeah, it's a very poignant note to end on. So thank you all for your contributions. And we've heard from Dr. Naya on the critical role of scientific research in shaping climate advocacy, from Daniel on the importance of ocean conservation for island resilience, Carla on how sustainable architecture can build more resilient communities. Ashley shared the power of youth-led advocacy, and Akwanje reminded us of the significance of grassroots movements in shaping these national and these regional climate policies. So together, you guys have highlighted this essential role that the youth can play in driving change, and how innovation, how leadership, how collective action are all crucial to tackling the climate crisis in island nations and beyond. So I think the key takeaway here is that young people must be part of this climate solution, at the heart of it, whether that is through scientific research like Naya, whether through advocacy, sustainable design, or grassroots movements, or all of them put together. Young people definitely have the power to shape a resilient and a sustainable future for all of us. So as we close today's session, I just want that to be a reminder of the urgency of climate action that requires all of us to step up, especially in the sort of wacky climate that we're in now politically in many places in the world. And the youth in particular have a huge role to play. So your voice, your passion, your actions are so essential. So thank you so much for showing up and for inspiring me and the rest of the Island Innovation team, and hopefully all of our audience as well. Please keep pushing for that change, keep inspiring all of us, and keep advocating for that future. So yes, thank you all again, and let's work together on building a meaningful and resilient future. Michaela, I will hand over to you for the last few points.
Thank you, Ari, and thank you to, of course, all of our speakers and our audience. I know we've gone over time, but this has been a very, very impactful discussion. And thank you all for being here today. I'm also happy to share that we will be hosting one more virtual session as a part of our webinar series. This webinar will be on climate finance for subnational island jurisdictions, and it will take place on Wednesday, 19th March. And it will, of course, explore the strategies for mobilizing and accessing climate finance to support the unique needs of subnational island territories. This will be the final webinar in the lead up to our Global Sustainable Island Summit, which will be taking place in St. Kitts and Nevis in May. In summary, this summit co-hosted with the government of St. Kitts and Nevis, is a platform for discussions on topics that, of course, are relevant to islands, such as climate resilience, sustainable tourism, agriculture, water security, and so much more. Everyone attending this webinar today will be receiving an exclusive discount code for the purchase of tickets to this event, so we hope to see lots of you there in person. And finally, I'd just like to add in that, as Ari mentioned at the start of the session, in addition to that main event, we will be hosting an Island Youth Forum as a pre-conference event. So this is a key opportunity for youth advocates to connect, to share their voices, and shape the future of island resilience. And there will be scholarships for students from island universities available through our Shared Ocean to support youth participation. So we'll be sharing more details on this and how you can apply via our social media platforms very, very soon. But we're very excited to continue this conversation on youth involvement and youth engagement in climate action in person at St. Kitts and Nevis. So thank you all for joining us again today, and we hope to see you in our next webinar. Bye-bye.
And I think we have just a quick video for those of you that are still on and still around. So yeah, please just take a second to listen to our wonderful Director of Projects, Grace.
Hi, I'm Grace Henry, Director of Projects here at Island Innovation, and I'm thrilled to invite you to the Global Sustainable Island Summit 2025, co-hosted with the Government of St. Kitts and Nevis, happening from May 27th to the 29th with a week-long series of events. This premier gathering is dedicated to advancing sustainable future for island communities, featuring insightful forums, a dynamic solutions expo, unparalleled networking opportunities, and the chance to experience the breathtaking beauty of St. Kitts and Nevis. Don't miss this opportunity to collaborate, innovate, and create solutions for a sustainable future. To purchase your tickets, please visit our website at islandinnovation.co and join us in shaping the future for island communities worldwide. See you there.
Thank you so much, and we hope to see you all in St. Kitts and Nevis in May.